Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele Glass here. We're still in chapter 14. Now we're thinking about descending tracts. So we should have a pretty good conception of what we mean by tract, right? So when we talk about tract, we're talking about white matter, correct? This is our myelinated axons in the central nervous system. And remember, we said carrying the same kind of information at about the same speed and in the same direction. And in the case of a descending tract, the direction is down, right? So now we're going from the brain out to the body. And so that means that we have motor information that we're talking about. And because we're focusing in chapter 14 on the somatic division of the nervous system, we're talking about the control of skeletal muscle, right? So we're talking about directions from the brain to the skeletal muscle. So when we talk about these descending tracts, we will see our processing center is the primary motor cortex, which, remember, we've talked about this as anatomically being located in the precentral gyrus, which y'all will recall is part of the frontal lobe. And so this is really important in processing, or let's say directing, voluntary movements. That's mostly what we're talking about here. Now, just like we had a sensory homunculus, and I super hope you took some time to do a little Google image search, and if not, do it because it's such an interesting looking diagram. So just like we had a sensory homunculus, which was this kind of map of how the neurons are receiving information from different parts of the body, we're going to have a motor homunculus. The homunculus word is like an old-fashioned word, like the ancients used this to talk about like little humans. So before we had this idea of cells, we thought, oh, maybe there's like a little tiny human inside kind of controlling things, right? And so the motor homunculus, remember, is a diagram or a map. When researchers looked at the precentral gyrus and kind of poked around literally in the brain, they were able to see, okay, this part is controlling movements of the hand, this part's controlling movements of the tongue, this part's controlling the muscle of the back. And just like we had different amount of neural tissue to process sensory information from different parts of the body, we have a different amount of neural tissue to direct different parts of the body. So anywhere where you have a lot of dexterity and fine movements, a lot of detailed motor skills, like in your mouth, your tongue, your hands, you're going to have more cortex dedicated to that. And then where you have your larger muscle groups and your gross movements, then you're going to have a less cortex dedicated to that. When we talk about the descending tracts, we're going to have two neurons in a chain. So we have, again, some serial processing perhaps, or we're going to get some convergent processing in some cases. We're going to have what's called the upper motor neuron. And then we're going to have the lower motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron is going to have its cell body in the primary motor cortex. So actually in the cerebrum, and it's going to synapse onto the lower motor neuron. And the lower motor neuron will either be in the brain stem, or we're going to see it in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. Because remember, the anterior gray horn contains the somatic motor nuclei, meaning cell bodies. And so the lower motor neuron is having its cell body located in the brainstem or the spinal cord, and then it's going to have its axon in the spinal nerve. Now, if it's coming off of the brainstem, then its axon is going to be in a cranial nerve. But primarily when we're talking about our tracks, we are thinking in terms of the spinal cord. So I think that's fair to say. Now, in the case of the descending tracks, we're not going to go quite as detailed as we did with the ascending. We're just going to fill in our chart, our table. And so you can still kind of take with you this concept that it's the pattern, is the organization of the nervous system that's really kind of, it's magical. I'm putting that in quotations. Kind of, it's a magical thing that it can do that allows us to collect all this information from, you know, the outside world and interpret it. What we're looking at here, of course, are our descending tracks. And I've done another chart. So this time we have 3 rows and again, the same 4 columns. So you could add it to that other chart if you had room. In this case, we have a first column titled track, and we're labeling our 2 rows as either corticospinal, one word, or we have 2 words in this second row, which is medial and lateral. Then we're looking at the type of motor information that's traveling, you know, and really we're looking at, you know, control of skeletal muscle. We still have this question of decussation. So where does that crossover, occur? And then we still have our processing center. So where is that signal in this case coming from? So if we start out with corticospinal, the name should tell us that we're a descending track. It tells us that it's starting at the cortex and it's ending at the spinal cord. So we can actually go ahead and write in our processing center, we're doing the primary motor cortex. And you just might want to remind yourself that's located in the precentral gyrus, which is located at the frontal lobe. Now, the corticospinal pathway is going to give us our voluntary control of our skeletal muscle. Voluntary, remember, means conscious level processing. So this is, again, primary motor cortex. This is, I'm going to write this down on this piece of paper. That's a voluntary control that I'm doing with my body. Now we're going to see crossover happens both at the brainstem and the spinal cord. And this really depends on, you know, if we're taking this motor information out of cranial nerve or if we're coming down to the spinal nerves. And we don't have to get that detailed, okay? When we look at the medial and the lateral pathways, what I want you to really see here is that this is an unconscious, I'm going to change color so it shows up better, unconscious modification of our skeletal muscle. And this unconscious we're getting from the cerebrum. We're getting these located in the diencephalon. So diencephalon, that's talking about both the thalamus and hypothalamus. And we're getting these being processed at the brainstem level. And in the case of the decussation, we don't have to know about that. What I want you to know is that the medial and lateral pathway is synapsing on the same lower neurons, lower motor neurons, as the corticospinal. So the difference is in the upper neuron. So that would be an example of convergence where you can have an upper neuron from the corticospinal pathway synapsing directly on the same lower motor neuron as a neuron from the medial and lateral pathway. And so this is important because we think about our skeletal muscle as our consciously controlled voluntary muscle, and that's true, but it's not 100% true. It's not true all of the time. And so that's really the takeaway here. All right, last up for chapter 14 is a conversation on reflexes. So stay tuned. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.